Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I appreciate the opportunity, but I must say that I'm feeling much less certain about what the lessons of the past might be. And I have been saying that the lessons, in particular, of uh, the Najibullah regime and what happened, where was the main lesson was that Najibullah's government did not fall because of the withdrawal of Soviet troops. It survived for several years after that. It fell not only when the aid from the Soviet Union stopped, but the Soviet Union actually ceased to exist. A very radical change in the regional environment. So not only was there no assistance coming and no uh, banknotes being printed, but there was not even any influential person in the capital to which they had been on which they had been dependent, to which they could whom they could contact or ask for advice. And therefore, I was saying that the most important thing was to be sure that U.S. financial and political support continued for the current government. And as long as that was the case, you have the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces and many other institutions. And it was extremely unlikely that the Taliban would be able to uh, seize power. Um, in fact, because the most of the foreign troops have been out of Afghanistan for quite some time, um, there was I thought that the immediate impact of their withdrawal might be relatively small. Of course, there would be some, but in fact, that does not seem to have been the case. And we see the Taliban advancing very rapidly. And what's most surprising, in a way, is they're advancing very rapidly in areas that they could not even enter before 2001. It's most striking, for instance, that the Taliban now control a very substantial part of Badakhshan province. As you know, before 2001, they were unable to advance beyond the river Kokcha, and that was at a time that they were fighting just the forces of Ahmad Shah Massoud, which were based to some extent in Tajikistan, and were not receiving anything remotely resembling the level of assistance that the Afghan government is still receiving. We see that the Taliban in the last few days have captured Islam Qala, Torghandi, um, a number of other strategic places. Of course, if they had made, of course, the fact that they captured Panjwai district in Kandahar is not very surprising. Many of their leaders are actually originally from Panjwai district, and that is part of their home turf. But the fact that they are making such advances in the north, um, I, 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 I have hypotheses to explain it, but I cannot fully explain it. Whether it is the weakness of the government, signals coming from Washington. I don't think we can attribute it to Pakistan because whatever Pakistan is doing, it has not changed in 20 years perhaps. Uh, so that cannot have made the difference at this point. Um, I think the lesson that lesson is for whom? Um, for the United States, I think there's a lesson which is more general. Perhaps that is of less concern to all of you, which is that the ability of the United States to transform other societies or to uh, build institutions there when it doesn't really understand them and doesn't have whatever it says it is impossible for it to have a long-term commitment to it because of geography and the nature of its interests. That ability is just very limited, and we've seen that in the failure of U.S. regime change operations, not only in Afghanistan but a number of others as well. Um, for the Afghans who are fighting or resisting the Taliban in some way, I think obviously, while the government and its other supporters are still receiving assistance from the United States. There still is a question of how to make use of that assistance in an effective way. I can't really speak in detail about what the problems are. I note that at the time of Najibullah, he was receiving much less foreign assistance, but he was free to print money. For instance, in the last few days, I've seen press reports that in many parts of the country, the police and the uprising forces and the military are not being paid. Um, and that's not because of a lack of money exactly, but on the other hand, it's because there are systems in place. At the time of Najibullah, the fighters, especially the militias, were paid. He just printed currency and delivered it to them in containers. The current government is not allowed to do that and it doesn't want to do that because, of course, it causes tremendous inflation, distorts the economy, and so on. But for Najibullah, for a few years, it was effective. I don't know what the lessons are there. Um, the there one lesson that many people are arguing is that the government is too centralized and therefore is not really is too detached from the people in various areas. That is, the security arrangements are all being coordinated from Kabul, except for certain last minute changes that go against President Ghani's longstanding policies, like supporting the uprising forces, supporting various militias. And that means that the local people are not really being mobilized in support of the forces, which are also, of course, factionalized. We can see that the current government, unlike Najibullah's government, does not have a political party to try to mobilize people. Again, that was not a popular political party. It had a lot of support, but had some kind of organization. The current government does not have that. So it may be that some kind of decentralized resistance will be more important. Now, lessons for the Taliban from history, which they claim to have learned, but I don't know if in practice they will implement them, is that it's impossible for any one group to rule or govern Afghanistan by itself. I think that's the most important lesson. And that even in addition, they understand that Afghanistan being a kind of poor, I don't know if they understand, they say that Afghanistan being as poor as it is and landlocked requires foreign assistance, and that requires a degree of accommodation with aid donors. The Taliban understand the need for foreign assistance, but they have not really demonstrated in any decisive way that they are willing to do the things that would be necessary for the government of Afghanistan under their influence or control to receive it. They have talked about inclusiveness and so on, but still their political models, to the extent that they have presented them, are still based on a kind of unitary power, highly centralized, based on religious scholars rather than on elections or some other system, but nonetheless still highly centralized in a way that would probably be rejected by a very large proportion of the country. So I think that overall the lesson is that none of the existing political forces really have come up with a way of either governing without foreign aid or with less foreign aid or with making use of what aid they might receive in a way that can guarantee stable and legitimate government. I don't mean to equate the various sides, but the problems that the current government is having with its security forces, with factionalism, defections, and so on, I think point to some serious political problems. Obviously, there's a psychological factor, which is the feeling of abandonment by the United States, and therefore the sense that the Taliban are going to be the winning side. But if I compare that to 1989 and so on, I don't see that much difference in the way the Soviets withdrew unconditionally, without insisting on implementation of the Geneva Accords, and the way the United States is doing it. Perhaps I'm wrong, and there are major differences. But at any rate, it points to. Um, I understood that the current institutions were relatively weak and dependent on foreign assistance, but the current speed of collapse in certain areas is surprising, and I don't quite know what to make of it. It's possible that it will be stopped now because people are getting more prepared, but in certain ways it's a situation where I think I'm not. I mean, the lessons of the past that I have been drawing may not be as relevant as I had previously thought, and I would need to understand the present situation better before thinking about what are the lessons of the past that are actually relevant.